What surprises will Apple's WWDC keynote bring?
And is Microsoft's Surface Laptop Go 2 a worthy MacBook Air competitor? Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. Hey there, welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading tech journalists to dive into the big tech stories of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined, as always, by Alex Kidman. Now, Alex, this week Amazon announced its automotive part finder, which lets you easily find parts supposedly for any car. What do you think the chances are of me finding a flux capacitor for a 1985 DeLorean?
Look, probably about as good as me finding a replacement chameleon circuit for my Type 40 time machine. I'm not putting the odds at good. I've looked through eBay, through Gumtree, you name it, I've looked. Although it's a chameleon circuit, so obviously it might look like something else. It might look like your flux capacitor.
I want to see the chameleon circuit in that little Nissan Leaf of yours.
Now, that's a tempting idea.
So speaking of tempting ideas, we're also joined once again by Pickr's Leigh Stark back in the Vertical Hold studios. Leigh, what obscure car part or other part would you like to find on Amazon?
My license. Because it's still only fairly new to me, so obviously I need to find that on Amazon.
And then what machine would you fix? What piece do you desperately need to get something?
I don't know enough about cars. This is like when people talk about fishing jokes. I don't know anything about cars.
This is your chance to riff, man. He talked about the TARDIS. Just rub with it.
Let's go for Starship Enterprise or something, but the good one, the one from Star Trek Voyager, because we've been through this before, and it's not Enterprise, it's Voyager.
Well, we might have to wrap things up there. I think we better move along. While we're all still friends. So speaking of tested friendships, WWDC is fast approaching and lots of hype that goes around that and what we may or may not hear from the keynotes. Some of us will be up in the crazy hours of the Tuesday morning. Some of us won't. But we'll just
Don't
see
rub it in.
But before we dive into that, let's look at what Microsoft's got on offer with its new Surface gear, and particularly the new Surface Laptop Go 2. Now, Leigh, there's a whole lot of Surface stuff going on here, under the surface even. What makes the Laptop Go 2 special? Who's it for? Why should we care?
I mean, it's supposed to be for students. That's predominantly what Microsoft have built this thing for. It's kind of it's supposed to be kind of mid-range, but its price pitches it at still relatively, it's still relatively high end, a $1,200 PC. I wasn't a huge fan of last year's Surface Go laptop because I thought it was underspec'd for what you got. So this year's one actually feels a little better. Last year, I think it started at 4 gig of RAM and 64 gig storage, which was not really enough to do anything. This year, they've at least moved up to 8 gig of RAM, 128 gig storage, so at least you know it can last more than 2 months. But I don't know. It's definitely geared at the student because that sort of price range you're typically targeting something like a MacBook Air, which feels like it's also due for an upgrade right about now.
Well, it's funny because you're right. The upgrades to this model are your kind of classic under the hood things. They're the things you can expect year in, year out from any laptop brand. If you've got a laptop, you can expect that next year's laptop will be much the same, but with a slightly faster Intel or AMD processor under the hood. But Microsoft had this really particular little dig at the MacBook Air specifically. Their sentence, and I'll read it out exactly, was, "The first-class Surface typing experience is uncompromised with 30% more key travel than a MacBook Air and complemented by a large precision trackpad." So they're going the MacBook Air really specifically. Now, to be fair,
is it the old MacBook Air?
The butterfly keyboard, that was my first thought. That thing was terrible.
Yeah,
because key travel is a very specific thing to want to have a go at them on.
But it does raise that kind of question within this student space. The MacBook Air is very popular in that space, largely because it's Apple's cheapest laptop. Let's not kid ourselves here. But the comparison between the two of them is kind of interesting. It's not quite as one way as I think some people might think.
That's why when I read that, I thought, is this the butterfly keyboard? Because since they've moved away from that, it's actually gotten a lot better. The keyboard on the MacBook Air is on the current MacBook Air is really usable. I actually find it's a great typing experience. The Surface keyboards can be hit and miss. I find the Surface laptop keyboards are a lot better than the type covers on their Surface devices. In fact, I used to go, and I've had this discussion with Alex before. I used to go through at least one Surface type cover every 3 months because I found they could only accept about 200,000 keystrokes before they conked out. And journos go through that remarkably quickly.
Yeah, well, the nice thing about getting the laptop version of a Surface is it has a keyboard in the box.
Mm.
This is still a bugbear of mine with the Surface Pro and the Surface Go and all their tablet-y units that you have to pay extra for the keyboard. The getting back to that MacBook comparison, though, there are some things I think that the Surface Laptop Go has that the MacBook doesn't that might make it a better choice for some users. I mean, for a start, it's got a touchscreen, which the MacBook doesn't. No MacBook has a touchscreen.
Not that Mac OS is. It's well, thing is that Mac OS is not really catered for a touchscreen anyway. It's not a big deal to Mac OS.
It's not
Deliberately,
that it couldn't do it.
Exactly. I mean, it. I will say that Mac OS is beginning to gear itself more like it should be used with a touchscreen because that clash of what iOS and Mac OS do, you still can't find a whole lot of iPad apps that run or iPhone apps that run on the latest versions of Mac with the M1 chip, but that will change gradually. But I don't think that's a huge issue. And I say this because I know that everyone around here has owned or has at least one computer with a touchscreen in it. How many of us are using laptops and physically touching the screen? We have tablets for that. I don't think it's a major issue that the MacBook Air doesn't have that.
But once you get used to it, you start to do it on other devices. Like I found, once I started using an iPad or a tablet more, I would get out a notebook and go to touch the screen. Or even if I've been using my Windows notebook, which has a touchscreen, I'll occasionally sit down in front of my Mac and go, boop. Oh, yeah, that's right. It doesn't work. So once you get, it's whatever you're used to using. I can understand why people, if they've all their other devices do it, my watch does it, my phone does it, my tablet does it, why shouldn't my computer do it?
Yeah, look, I'm not proud of the fact, but I've done exactly the same thing, Adam. I have tapped at the screen of a MacBook, and then suddenly the neurons in my brain fire up, going, "Idiot! It doesn't do that."
I've scrolled down on a piece of paper with 2 fingers. Right? So,
oh wow!
Yeah.
I've not had that problem so far, but and I know a lot of people who use Macs who have not had to do that as often, or at least have not admitted that's the other possibility. They might have happened, they just not admitted to it. I don't know if it's necessarily something that matters yet, but again, this is a request. It's been a request for the longest time. Remember when people were hackintoshing touchscreens onto Macs? So nothing about this is new, but I think it's dependent on the app that you're using. Like I would love to use a touchscreen on a Mac in Photoshop or Premiere or something that actually has a tactile interface, but I can get around with a better mouse than the Magic Mouse, so I'm totally fine.
Every mouse is a better mouse than the Magic Mouse.
That's true. Every mouse is a better mouse than the Magic Mouse. That's true. That's something we can agree on.
Not having a mouse is a better mouse than the Magic Mouse.
Yeah, this we don't necessarily agree on best science fiction shows, but we totally agree on Magic Mouse alternatives. Absolutely.
You can stay.
I guess the other thing for that student perspective and for that comparison between the two, students might look at the Surface Laptop Go 2 and say, hey, well, this thing is $1,199 for the cheapest model. The cheapest MacBook Air you can get is $1,499.
Yeah, there is that side of things as well. I did note that. I think part of it also that bothers me is that the resolution on the Surface is still really low. It's a 1536 by 1024, which is a surprise. I mean, it's a weird aspect ratio. That's very normal for Surface. They like to use these squarish aspect ratios that are more like paper.
3:2, I think?
3:2, yeah. They're a fan of 3:2, and I think some of the other ones are 5:4. But they like weird aspect ratios because it's more like paper. It gives you technically more screen real estate, but a lower resolution doesn't give you a lot to work with in modern apps. And so it was a bugbear of mine in last year's model that the 12-inch screen had a lower. It was marginally better than HD, but not by much, and that really hasn't changed. And that's one of those things where if you look at a Mac, I'm not going to I've not seen the new Surface, and I've not seen whatever new Mac is clearly probably going to come out next week or at least be announced. But the current generation, you do get better screens, and screens are a bugbear of mine because the technology should be a lot better in a lot of laptops that we see, and it's something that we don't. Dynabook was a perfect example of that, where you can find some really interesting laptops from what is basically the new Toshiba, but oftentimes the screens are the worst parts.
Now, you could look at this the other way as well. We're comparing it to the MacBook Air, but this is also being pitched as a Chromebook competitor as well. I'm not sure how realistic that is, but it's sort of because they're both aimed at the that education market. Do you see it sitting there as a Chromebook competitor?
I don't. I don't, because the price doesn't make any sense for a Chromebook competitor.
Mm.
Chromebooks are inexpensive. They're, at most they typically top out at the high end. What they top out at $1,000. The low end they top out at $200 roughly. So you're going to hit somewhere around there. They are economical machines that are versatile, provided you like Chrome OS. That's okay for most education. Like if the high school students, primary school students, things like that don't need much more than productivity. Everyone is different. I don't see it a Chromebook competitor. I see it as an early Windows machine, effectively.
The thing is, though, locally, I think you're totally right. I don't think it's a Chromebook competitor because Chromebooks locally are just not that competitive. They're not
Mm.
that big a segment of the market, and the range and choice that we have is quite limited as a result. In the States, though, where Microsoft really does care about these things, yeah, they're a bigger segment. There are more expensive Chromebooks. And I'll be honest, I'm sort of devil's advocating here, actually, because I'd probably buy the MacBook Air over the Surface Laptop Go 2. But if you said Surface Laptop Go 2 or similar high-end Chromebook, I would lean towards the Go 2 simply because of that Windows 11 ecosystem, of that wider range of apps compared to a Chromebook. Chromebook's great if you want that lockdown, as you say, primary or
Mm.
maybe high school experience. But if you actually want to do a bit more, you're going to be able to do a bit more with that Surface.
It's also worth noting that when you look at the US price of what the Surface Laptop Go 2 is, it's probably closer to where a Chromebook is pitched in the US. In America, the Surface Laptop Go 2 starts at $599. That's granted, that's US dollars, but when you convert that using current exchange and you factor in tax, that still equals under $1,000. So we're clearly being charged the Australia tax again, and that's partly why I have a hard time seeing this as a Chromebook competitor as well, because it's actually more expensive than it really should be where it's pitched overseas.
Yeah, no, I noticed that as well. It's a fairly nasty sting as well.
Mm,
It should be about even allowing for GST because US list prices never include sales tax.
that's right.
I've said this so many times. But even allowing GST, it should be
About
about
900.
920 was where
Yeah.
I came to. And because I was writing this up before I had the local figures, I kind
Ditto.
of figured, right, 920, it'll be 999 because that's usually the way those things go.
Yeah.
And when they announced, oh yeah, it's $1,199, my jaw dropped. I thought,
Yeah.
wow,
It's
that's painful.
way more expensive than it should be. When I was writing up the release note, and there was literally a paragraph in it saying, technically, if we translate this should equal about $999. And then I looked in the Microsoft store and went, sorry, what? Because that's not a good price for what you're being pitched. It gears itself up as a slightly less expensive MacBook Air. Totally understand that. But again, the MacBook Air has more power, and it probably will have better battery life as well, because that M1 chip is quite capable. Will it be better? I don't know. I've never had good luck getting Windows 11 to hit any Windows operating system to hit the actual achievable battery life any laptop manufacturer says. But with Mac, I can usually get within spitting distance.
So, if you could change one thing with the laptop Go 2 to make it a winner, what would it be?
I am seriously going to come back to the screen for me. If I could change two, it'd be the price, because the price should be better, but the screen is still like, it's the one thing they didn't change from last year, and it's the one thing I complained about that I like en masse, because it's just low end. It's the sort of thing you'd expect in a $400 or $500 computer, not a $1,000 computer.
See, I don't know for that student market that the screen is as important as you say it is for every student.
Tell a
But
student working on Photoshop to work in
absolutely,
1024.
no, totally, totally. For image or video related work, I totally get it.
Yeah.
For more regular work, they're maybe not going to notice. What I would change, if you couldn't change the screen, I agree with you. A nicer screen's always going to be nicer.
Yep.
Is the ports, because
Mm.
you get one USB A, one USB C, and that's your lot. And I find this with a lot of your Ultrabooks and even the MacBook Airs and things like that. 2 ports is not enough.
No.
By the time I'm hooking up an external display, by the time I'm throwing external peripherals on there, because I'll use the keyboard on a laptop when I have to, but otherwise I'd much rather use something that's a bit more flexible. By the time I'm doing all of that, I'm out of ports. I can't connect anything, and then I'm playing cable juggling game. It's a nightmare. I want more ports, and I will buy a laptop that has more ports than this, or a MacBook Air, to be fair to
But
both sides.
And worth noting, if the price, we could probably both agree that the price is problematic. If the price was $999 flat, it would be a much more compelling option, because then it's a good $500 difference to the MacBook Air. At that point, the
Absolutely.
comparison is much more clear. You're buying what is clearly a student device. That's a totally logical approach, but it's Microsoft, so they added more money.
Okay, so as was alluded to earlier, I will be getting up way too early in the morning on Tuesday morning for Apple's Monday US time WWDC keynote because I had the misfortune to become a tech journalist and didn't choose a proper career. Um,
Do you want to
and
hear something funny?
sure,
I've never watched a keynote in my entire 15 years of being a journalist. I have yet to do this.
and that's the last we'll hear from Leigh on the show.
I might have to count myself out there too. I don't get up at 3 o'clock in the morning for stuff like that.
The two of you just get out. I hate you. I hate you. I hate you all. I hate you all. I hate getting up that early in the morning, but sometimes it's just necessary in the way that I work. Apple, of course, tries to keep things massively under, you know, behind steel curtains and non-disclosure agreements and all the rest of it. But there's a lot of suggestion, and the rumor mill churns ever onwards. What are we seeing out there that's being predicted for WWDC? Leigh?
The obvious one I know about is a MacBook Air. I mean, it's a year and a half roughly between models now, so MacBook Air makes sense. Basically, M2 chip. That's what we think is going to come. It makes sense because WWDC is it's a development event, and you want to talk about your latest and greatest. And we've seen a lot of M1 chips in the past. It's all Apple Silicon, but the M2 will be whatever the next thing is. So it makes sense that we're going to hear about an M2 chip and a new MacBook, which all the rumors kind of painted as going to have colors like the iMac, which will be nice, and it'll be a little bit faster. And basically, if you're listening to this show right now and you desperately have to purchase a MacBook right now, just wait. Just that's the PSA right now. Just wait, because you never know, in the next week or so, you could have just saved yourself money by getting a newer computer.
My only problem with those rumors, I totally agree, colors and stuff like that's going to happen. Why would Apple put an M2 chip, presumably a more powerful chip, in its lowest end MacBook when it's got all the pros there that it wants to sell?
Yeah.
There's nothing to suggest the M2 will necessarily have more power or more grunt than an M1 Pro or an M1 Max, because it's not just about the architecture. It could also be, well, not rather the speed of the generation. It could be the architecture. I mean, we have seen various A series chips over the years that pop up in different computers. It wouldn't shock me if the M2 is if it does happen this way, it wouldn't shock me if the M2 isn't quite as powerful as an M1 Pro, but is more powerful than, say, an M1 standard.
So I kind of assumed that the M1 would just sort of stand for a while. I hadn't really thought about it in terms like is it the Bionic chips in the iPhone where you get a new one pretty much every year, and the Intel you get your 10th
Well,
generation, your 11th generation.
it's been roughly 2 years since Apple first announced the first generation. That's the thing, which is a long time in chip architecture.
So you reckon they'll keep turning them over? We'll get an M3 and M4 every couple of years? Because I don't see anyone standing around going, shit, that M1 chip is slow.
No, that's true. But see, I don't know. They don't have to replace it. But the problem is, if they do decide to upgrade it, there's got to be a pretty compelling reason why, and colors won't cut it for people. The one that really confuses me is the 13-inch MacBook Pro. I actually don't know what the point of that thing is anymore. I didn't know what the point of it was when it was released alongside the MacBook Air, because it was identical to the MacBook Air, except it gave you a slightly bigger battery. And I think that was roughly it.
See, it wouldn't surprise me to see them cull that one. And I agree with you. It was basically the same. It had the touch bar was the other thing.
Yeah,
The Air
yeah.
doesn't.
Ooh,
And the touch bar is on the Pro, which frankly leads me towards the Air anyway.
Mm.
The thing is, though, I still come back to this thing that I think when Apple brings out a chip called an M2, just for marketing reasons, it's going to be more powerful. So I could see an M1 Plus, an M1 Gen 2 or something, but M2 feels to me like it's going to be where they go as the next step. They're not going to want to confuse people thinking, oh, if I buy this, it's going to be as good as the M1 Ultra, things like that. Also, Apple, for its MacBooks, has been very happy. Actually, Apple, for its Macs, period, has been very happy to sit on quite old chips for a long time. It has had some really, really long running chips in certain systems, certain configurations. And let's face it, there is still a chip shortage going on, and prices are high. They may well debut new machines, but I have this feeling it might be a bit Malibu Stacy's got a new hat color rather than here's a massively more powerful machine just because we can.
Can I give you a crazy reason why they might introduce a new chip? You could be right. It could be an M1 Model 2 or something like that. There's something really crazy I've noticed when I've been testing Macs and I use all these headphones. I use the Dolby Atmos stuff. Everyone knows I'm kind of obsessed with that sort of stuff. It's that the current M1 generations, the only ones that work with spatial audio coming from a laptop are the M1 Pro, M1 Max, and M1 Ultra. Nothing else will talk to them. So if you have an M1 in your, even though it's technically obviously the same thing, if you have an M1 MacBook Air and an M1 MacBook Pro or an M1 iMac, it doesn't actually talk to Dolby Atmos on the headphones at all, which is rather interesting, I found. And Apple, the last time I checked it, there was like an Apple technical thing saying it doesn't work on that generation. So you have to kind of have a new chip for it. It wouldn't shock me as a way of also trying to get people to move headphones that they actually upgraded the chip specifically for something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense because I've got a MacBook Pro, so it does do the spatial thing, and it never occurred to me that it didn't work with the standard M1.
It works on the 14, it works on the 16, doesn't work on the Air at all, which I found interesting. The other rumor, I would love them to upgrade the Mac, the proper Mac Pro, I guess, but the Mac Studio kind of does that, and no one really knows how that's going to go. But the other thing I've heard, which is I've heard this now for 2 years, and the rumors keep ramping up again, which is the idea of an Apple search system, like an Apple search engine, so a competitor to Google. And the rumors are ramping up pretty aggressively again this year. It would make a lot of sense. Apple has a lot of data. Siri, when you ask it things, it's not always the most reliable thing using someone else's search engine. So maybe if they have their own, it would actually do a lot of really cool things. And also, there's that whole advertising angle, the privacy, things like that. That gives it a little bit more to work with. But whether it actually comes out next week, giant question mark. I don't quite know if it's going to be something that people actually need or even want in their lives. Obviously, it gives Safari, if it was real, it gives Safari a default search engine to work from. But how many people are necessarily going to run to that versus Google? I mean, look at Bing.
I'm getting horrible early Apple Maps flashbacks because it took a long time for Apple Maps to get particularly good. I could see it happening, but Apple would have to be pretty sure that its ad revenue from all of this search data was going to be massive because let's not forget, Google currently pays Apple squillions of dollars just to be that default search thing on iPhones, for example. And the moment it comes out with a search engine, you can bet that deal's off the table.
Yeah, I can see that, but also I can see the amount of ad money that Apple could probably make from its own search engine would be a huge factor as well. I mean, part of what we all know this. I'm an SEO in my day job, but you can see it from pretty much every ad department. Everyone is going to spend with Google on ads. Bing makes money that way. DuckDuckGo, I think, makes money that way as well. It doesn't really matter if you have a search engine that people are actively using, then you're going to make money off that. It is entirely possible. I don't know. I've not done the numbers that if Apple does launch its own search engine, maybe it stands to make even more money. Not that it needs more. I mean, for crying out loud, it's probably the most lucrative company in the free world at the moment. But at that point, maybe there's more money to be made off that.
I worry, though, that the answer to the question, what's wrong with my MacBook, is going to be nothing is wrong every single time.
You're holding it wrong.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're doing it wrong.
That was the case with a generation of iPhone, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And it was their response. The problem is on your end because everything we make is perfect.
Well, speaking of making things perfect, the other big rumor in hardware and software, and this is a developer conference, is around Apple's VR ambitions and the whole Reality OS.
Reality
thing.
OS, yeah.
And the rumors seem to bounce around between, oh yes, Tim Cook will just bound out on stage in a VR headset because there's AR hidden things in the invites for next week's keynote, to no, they're definitely not going to show anything off and it's years away from completion. Leigh, where do you see that one playing out?
I feel like it's years away for completion. I don't know if anyone's really necessarily ready for it outside of the obvious section of VR fanboys. Apple has obviously spent a lot of time trying to get people ready for AR, which is great. I mean, the fact that you can use your iPhone, and you can do it on Android as well. iPhone supports AR Kit, and Google uses AR Core. It's great that there are so many AR solutions to guide people into using this whole world. I don't think Oculus has quite revived VR the way everyone expected it would. Same with HTC. I love VR. I've always loved it ever since I mistakenly watched Lawnmower Man and wished it wasn't so crap, and desperately wanted to try all the other virtual reality gear. There was one when I was growing up called Virtuality, and it was awful. It was like 320 by 240, but I still loved it because of what it represented. Sticking yourself in a world. I loved it, but that doesn't mean everyone else will. And it's a really unusual experience because you kind of have to segregate yourself off from reality, ironically, to use it. I don't think we're at that point where it matters just yet. I think it's still going to take some time to get people into it. I suspect Apple gets that as well. If anything, they'll tease it, and that will be enough to kind of whet the palates because there's enough of these cool devices out there that are exciting to look at. But I don't know of anyone who's actually buying them and using them. I love the idea of the Oculus Quest and that HTC one that looks like
The
a pair of
Vive. Yep.
glasses. Yeah, well, not the Vive, but the Vive Flow. I think it is the one
yeah.
the one that looks like you've popped out of a P Diddy video, or something. It's I really like the idea, but I've not met a single person who buys one, and I think that's probably normal. I don't think Apple's quite ready yet to say, hey, AR and VR at fever pitch, let's revolutionize it now. I still think we've got a year or two before this matters. Registering a trademark for Reality OS is one thing, showing it to the world is something completely different.
Is part of that is because there's no killer mainstream application for it yet. Like even look at the PlayStation had the VR headset. You think that'd be the closest it would come to making becoming a mainstream thing, and I don't think it set the world on fire.
Well, this is the thing. I think I disagree with you, Lee. I don't think they're even going to tease it because I think the moment you tease it, you start building that expectation. If they can't deliver to market in 6 months, say, and with chip shortages, with everything else that's going on, that would feel like a very short time frame. I reckon what they'll do, if anything, is they will start lining up developers who may be at or attending or virtually attending WWDC to start developing for it. Because this is Apple's secret sauce for these things. It wants to have a big library of apps. So it doesn't just say, right, here's our VR headset and you can do a few things, and here's Job Simulator, which everyone has, and here's Superhot, which everyone has, because that would not sell an Apple VR headset to consumers. But what they do, and they do this all the time. You see this every time they launch a new iPhone. They'll have 4 or 5 developers who'll say, we developed our game with the new chip. And clearly, they signed tons of NDAs. They've been working on it for 3 to 6 to 12 months, and they're ready to roll, that day or very soon. I reckon that's what they'll do with this, bearing in mind it's a developer conference, that they'll start getting external developers on board.
I can actually see that. Part of the reason I think they'll tease it is because, as you said, it's a giant developer conference, and I feel like they'll give a lot of people a reason to say, hey, I really want to do something different. But even if they don't, we'll start to see people developing or wanting to test the waters anyway for AR and VR. Apple is pushing a lot of AR stuff. We know that much. And Reality OS could just be the start of that. Whether it's a VR headset or an AR headset, it could be a mixed reality headset, similar to like the whole Google Glass mentality, where it puts things in front of your vision instead of just being total virtual reality. It will be one of the two, and we could end up seeing just examples of what they're doing, what they're planning. However, we're just not ready yet. No one is going to buy a headset just yet. Until there is, as you said, Adam, that killer app, it doesn't exist yet. Well, that's because nothing amazing can happen from these things. I still think AR is going to be easier to connect with for most people because putting on a pair of glasses and having the digital world connect is something you don't have to segregate yourself from the world for. You can wear a pair of glasses, still talk to your friends, you are connected. But when you have to put on a headset, you are totally isolated. And I don't know about you guys, but with 2 kids, I don't have the time to do that. I don't know a lot of people who do have the time to be isolated. I once experimented with a story for the AFR where I got a HTC headset in and I was like, I'm going to try working in virtual reality. And The theory was I could have lots of desktop spaces and I could type in there, and all it did was expand my screens. It just gave me an infinite number of screens to work with. It didn't actually change that I was still stuck at my desk typing away. Nothing about that experience got any different. If anything, it was just my scenery changed. And that's kind of the issue I think VR has at the moment. You are isolating yourself. Nothing is really changing. Much like how 5G doesn't yet have a killer app, VR doesn't have one either.
The thing with VR is what they're working towards, and they can already do in some spaces, is basically multi-user VR, things like the zero latency gaming,
Mm.
where multiple people can be in the same VR environment and see each other and engage with each other. At that point, it's got a lot more use cases, as you say, similar to AR, because AR, I can still see you standing next to me. But to do that multi-user VR environment is very difficult to do in your lounge room. You can do a single user VR, and the headset can have outward facing cameras that measures the room, so you don't need to fill the room with cameras anymore. But as soon as you put two people in the room together, it's very difficult to get them to engage with each other. Once
You're
the
going to literally
technology,
clash heads.
yes,
Yeah.
but it's probably not far from, like, it's already possible to do it in the right environment. Once that becomes easier to do in your average lounge room, then the use case will expand for, because as you say, everyone in the room can have one on and be doing something together.
And in that point, it's actually logical. It makes a lot of sense. But
Yeah.
right now, we're nowhere near that. We all know that. Remember the the HoloLens was supposed to do similar things to that, but it ended up being a expensive device that was basically just for development, and it didn't eventuate into
It
that.
was never
In
really aimed at
Windows,
consumers, though. The HoloLens was
no,
always a
it wasn't.
businessy kind of thing.
It wasn't, but they evolved the mixed reality headsets from that sort of stuff as well, and they didn't really take off either. Acer and HP had them, and no one really bought into them. We still don't have, I guess, a system that does this, but it'll come. I just don't think it's there yet.
Well, speaking of things that probably, well, no, not probably, definitely will come. We will see new Apple operating systems. They will
Yeah.
start talking about the successors to Monterey. They'll start talking about, what is it, iOS 16 and iPad OS and Watch OS and TV OS and everything OS. What are we expecting to see there? What do we think they're going to be doing, or what are the rumor mills suggesting they're going to be doing?
I don't know much about Mac OS because I don't really know where they're going to go with this. I know with iOS they want to change the lock screen because it right now doesn't do much, and the understanding is they want to use OLED displays the way Android devices have for a long time, which is have a always on sort of lock screen. I've grown to like iOS a lot more over the past few years than I ever have, so I'm kind of excited to see that sort of design. If anyone can kind of clear that up from being just a clock, it's Apple. But I don't know what they're going to add next. I'm excited to see what these things will do. What have you heard?
So, like you, the lock screen seems to be the big thing that everyone's agreed. Oh, yes, that's going to come in there, and that's going to come as a function of having OLED screens where it's easier to do. I can't get that excited because, yeah, it's been an Android feature
on Android forever.
That's never stopped Apple before. Let's be honest.
Absolutely. I actually think for iOS, in a weird way, until they're ready to bounce into, for example, foldables or different form factors, there's part of me that goes, I don't really want them to mess with too much stuff. I'm not saying iOS is perfect. It can use optimizations, it can use security fixes. There are things that they could tweak or even open up, although this is Apple, so that's not super likely. But I feel like they're in a situation where they might get tempted to do the kind of change for change's sake thing. And I don't know that that's a net positive for most iPhone users. Where I do want to see change, where I desperately, desperately want them to make some big changes, is in iPad OS. Because they're still continuing down this journey of saying, oh, look, the base model iPad, sure, that's just for consumption. It's simple. It is very basic. Everything else, though, oh no, that's a productivity device. That's a creativity device. You can do things with this. Please buy it, the pencil and the Magic Keyboard and all these things, which is lovely in theory if you've got the budget for it. But as soon as you put it up against, the MacBook Air that we've been talking about so much this episode, I'll take the MacBook Air every day of the week because it does so much more. I want iPad OS to get closer to that.
One of the things that's bothered me ever since we saw the M1 chips appear in iPads has been the fact that you have the same chip that's in the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro and all the other Macs, and you have it. Technically, it has the ability to run things like Final Cut and Logic, and it doesn't. Even though the M1 Max can run iOS apps, for some reason it doesn't go the other way. And it is infuriating because I love the idea of having an iPad Pro that I could bring Logic and all the other things on because it's small and simple and honestly can be packed up really nicely, but you can't do it. And that's what I wish iOS or iPadOS 16 supported. I wish those apps went the other way and said, hey, now you can choose whichever device you want. And that kind of brings you back to that original idea that you guys were debating with me in the beginning of this show, which is that if you had an iPad and it ran iPadOS and then ran those apps that, were macOS specific, you would have a touchscreen Mac effectively. You would actually have a touchscreen Mac that ran the apps you want, but it actually wasn't a Mac. It skirted around the issues because it ran iPadOS instead.
So you want to run Mac OS in parallels on an iPad?
No, oh God, no! I absolutely don't want to do that. You're trying to terrify me. I'm not that much of a masochist. Crying out loud.
Well, what that was making me think of is that, remember, we haven't seen it for a long time, but there used to be this idea of dual operating system notebooks that would run Windows, but also this lightweight, Linuxy operating system that might run on a front screen or kick in before the whole thing boots up. So you could sort of jump between one and the other depending on what you wanted to do. So you're almost looking for an iOS device that can then boot up into Mac OS when you need it and then drop back into iOS when you don't.
No, I think what Leigh's talking about is actually running the Mac app on an iPad, but not running
on
full Mac
iOS.
OS.
Yeah, because that's what it should do. If they run the same chip and the same instructions and they can support each other's stuff, then why does it go one way but not the other?
I suspect the reason is because the moment you try and run Final Cut Pro on an iPad, the battery life is going to drop to minutes.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
But I would still like to see that.
You still want it.
I still want it because at least that point, Apple is saying, hey, you're choosing the type of device that you want and the app that you want that goes with you regardless. And that's what I like about that.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Leigh for joining us this week.
Thank you, guys.
And Leigh, as it is written in the Vertical Hold Constitution, I must now ask you the Vertical Hold 3 questions of doom.
I fail this every time. Why do we keep doing this to me?
Because you get the answers wrong.
Yeah,
we have to have the Star Trek argument again.
We find out more about you every single time.
Gosh, it's like a CV, but worse.
Absolutely. 3 questions. I'll ask all of them. Then you can answer them. I always have to say this because somebody jumps in, and it might well be you. So don't do that.
It's always me.
It's not just always you. Where can people find your work online? Where can they find you on social media online? And when Hollywood is casting Leigh Stark, the movie, who's playing you and why?
Oh, God. Can I have more than 5 seconds to think of this? You can find me at pickr.com.au. You can find me on Twitter at Lilo. And when they're casting me, let's go with Chris Evans. If he can pull off Buzz Lightyear, he can definitely pull off Leigh Stark.
We'll leave that as an open casting call, I think. You can catch us online at Vertical Hold AU on Twitter, at verticalhold.com.au on the web, or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
And as a reminder for regular listeners, we're thrilled to have Aussie Broadband as our sponsor this year, and they've given us a special promo code which gives new customers a $10 per month discount for 6 months when signing up online for an unlimited plan between NBN 50 and NBN 100. The promo code is vertical, so hopefully that'll come in handy for Australian listeners shopping around for a great broadband service. And as always, thanks everyone for dropping by. Don't forget to tell your friends about us. Don't forget to tell Chris Evans about us and help us spread the good word in 2022. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. What is that noise? It sounds like a dog drinking. Was it a dog drinking?
It's a dog drinking.
I'm not going crazy. All right.